Together with her co-author, Professor Singh, Professor Blondell is part of an ongoing project in the Los Angeles community, working with the Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles Women's Police Officer Association to design training and build trust and legitimacy through shared police and community experience. The project began in 2017 and continues to this day. And Professor Blondell will focus on several aspects of her ongoing research that she included in the paper, Cops, Community, and Conversation, a critical thinking analysis of a community law enforcement empathy and trust building exercise. We've also invited to deepen our consideration of this subject, a scholar and former law enforcement leader. And we're pleased to welcome back Dr. RaShall Brackney, a veteran officer, a former police chief at George Washington University and the Charlottesville, Virginia Police Department. She's now a distinguished visiting professor at George Mason University. And so what we will do is hear from Professor Blondell first, have Dr. Brackney respond, and then I'll introduce the second paper and the second set of authors to you, so that'll be a little bit closer in time to their presentation. So Dr. Blondell, why don't you get us started? Professor Blondell. You got a promotion.
I did get a promotion. I did notice that. Thank you, Carl. Thank you. So I'll tell you a little bit about the project and then the findings and we'll go from there. So this project, as you said, started in 2017. It was a project that is a part of a series of grants and work that we're doing with LAPD. So we have grants with the JAMS Foundation and the Police Foundation, and this is a grant with Open Society. My background is in public sector dispute resolution. So for 20 years prior to coming to Pepperdine, I have a pension in city, state, county, and federal government. I worked for all entities and worked in public sector dispute resolution. When I came to Pepperdine, my interest was in exploring law enforcement. We will talk more about it, but law enforcement is it's a closed community. It's a very particular culture, and it's difficult often to make entrees into working in the law enforcement environment. So to talk about this project and this grant, I have to go back a little bit to a grant before. I started working in about 2015 with the Director of Constitutional Policing at LAPD. The thought there that we shared was that until LAPD cleaned up its own house somewhat, working with the community would be difficult. There were the number of, in terms of a risk management issue, the number of, well, let's put it this way, the amount of money spent on cop disputes significantly was out spending the settlements with the community. There's lots of power dynamics in that, but also it was reflective of an organization that needed reform from within before working with the community. So we worked for several years training over 800 officers in conflict resolution skill sets. After doing that work, we went and proposed working with the community. That project was designed as an empathy and trust building project. It came out of the 21st Century Commission on Policing, and it was not framed exclusively around race and justice. It was framed around empathy and trust building. That's an important distinction that we can talk about later as well. The findings that I have, I think are centrally around the difficulties of convening, around what we've talked about already today and hope we talk about more, the myth of power balancing. the realities of working within a system, simple acts like deployment can be epic in terms of lifts. So the realities of fitting within a law enforcement environment and the dynamics that are happening within that particular law enforcement environment. And finally, I'm hoping that we talk a little bit about de-escalation and the importance and need of reframing the conversation around de-escalation. So those are the findings I had. The project itself was a 3-day project in the pilot phase. It will not continue to be a 3-day project, but it involved a day of training community, a day of training officers, and a day of bringing them together to do step into each other's shoes, empathy-based, self-projection and point of view types of exercises. The curriculum for the officers and the community mirrored one another somewhat, but not entirely. The curriculum for officers was around awareness building in terms of community and what a tight community they are, closed community they are. I worked with Dr. Singh and Schaffner Roberts as the training team in terms of working with issues of culture and community. It was also skills-based. And so the simple skills became the most important, basing a lot of material around Ken Cloak, accusation as confession type of skills building exercises. So the officers would write down the worst thing the community had ever said to them, and then practice identifying the interests behind it, those types of exercises. In the community, we worked more on how to tell your story. That was after the pilot. We realized that the communities of color, women of color in particular, despite being represented in the room, the voices were not being lifted up. And so that, as part of redesigning, that was part of the curriculum design. The final day of stepping into each other's shoes, I'm pretty sure I've hit my 7 minutes, so I'm gonna stop, Carl. And we can go from there.
Well, that's fine. The paper I know is available. And at this point, then, thank you, Professor Blondell. We've asked Dr. Brackney to offer some observations and comments related to the subjects that you've raised.
So thank you for having us. I mean, really is a brave endeavor for anyone who would try to penetrate LAPD in any form or any fashion. And when I was reading the paper, what I was struck by is the things that were not written in the paper about assumptions. And what might some of those assumptions have been about the organization itself and about the community, and how those assumptions, whether we understood them or not, whether they were bracketed in advance, could influence the work. And one of them particularly was assumptions about the singularity of focus and camaraderie within the police department, right? You mentioned they wear one uniform, they have unions, they eat together, they dine together, they're in cars together, and the community is not necessarily coming from that same point of view or point of perspective. But then there was the tension between the amount of lawsuits where they're not singularly focused, where people don't feel like they belong and don't feel like they're part of the community. And what I was thinking about and would ask you to think about and maybe even comment on is, then how do you position yourself, right, to be effective if some of the assumptions that you have about that community and the culture and the systems in that community continue to reinforce itself, and you're thinking about these engagements and conversations, a 3-day training, even 800 officers being trained in conflict resolution, even the assumptions about what does conflict resolution look like for an officer or for a community, right? And staying away from buzzwords that allow LAPD and the policing institution to continue to function. And what do I mean by that? One of the outcomes is focusing on de-escalation, right? If we focus on de-escalation, then there's no ownership by LAPD or any law enforcement officer for their behaviors, for their escalating behaviors, right? We then get to put the problem on the community and that we were not able to de-escalate properly. We didn't have the skills or the training or the abilities to de-escalate that situation. What we don't focus on is how officers often escalate the situation, and then which they would then have to use de-escalation techniques to manage a condition that they created. And part of that, so as you think about that, you also had a really interesting quote that is in the paper that says that there needed to be a return to relational fundamentals, and what that might mean for you from your point of view, and how that might differ for the community or differ for LAPD. And my last comment on that, when we talk about relational fundamentals, is acknowledging there is always going to be a power dynamic. So that relational fundamental for a community is not as comfortable as we would like to believe when we think about these concepts and constructs of policing.
Thank you, Dr. Brackney.
Thank you.
This is brave work that we're engaged in, and both of these teams, both of these papers, working in an ongoing basis. Again, this is not research or work that has been completed. There are ongoing relationships still. And with that, let me turn now to the multidisciplinary team, I think it would be correct to describe, that offers our second paper, designing a pilot software to improve police interactions with Black civilians through technology grounded in dispute resolution and critical race theory. First with us is Professor Katrina Lee, the director of the program on dispute resolution at the Moritz College of Law and a clinical professor of law. Also with us is Dr. Simone Drake, the Youngberg Trustee Distinguished Professor in the Department of English, who is also an affiliate to the Moritz College of Law and the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, as well as the Department of African American and African Studies and the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And lastly is Dr. Kevin Passino. Dr. Passino is a professor of electrical and computer engineering at the Ohio State University College of Engineering. His expertise is in technology for social justice, technologies to alleviate poverty, racism, and mental illness. And so this interdisciplinary team collaborated on a project that targets law enforcement officers and raises this question: how can technology enhance in-person instructional training related to diversity and cultural competency while simultaneously reducing resistance and or resentment of DEI training? And so against that background, Professor Lee, I think you're going to start us off.
Sure. I'm really excited to be here with my colleagues and with all of you to talk about our project. This is the first time that we've talked together as a team in a public forum about our project. And I just want to congratulate Stephanie on her project. It is indeed brave. I can say just personally that working on this project has made me nervous in so many ways. And I'm going to start talking about the project, but I just wanted to share that. So today is about rethinking. And our project is about rethinking traditional diversity, equity, and inclusion training for law enforcement. That's our interest. And the way we went about this was, and I would say that our rethinking has occurred, but we're trying to get at it in two main ways. And so one way is through our multidisciplinary approach, as Carl has mentioned. And so our team consists of myself, I'm from law, and then bringing the lens of Dr. Drake's critical race and gender studies expertise. And then for the first time in my life, I'm working with an electrical and computer engineer, Kevin, right here. And then we also, who's not joining us on stage, but will be at the part 3 presentation, Hugo Gonzalez Villasante has an expertise in education. So that's at one level, a way in which we are tackling this and trying to intervene in traditional DEI training is by applying this multidisciplinary approach. And the second level at which we are trying to get at this with our intervention is with technology and using technology. And really get at, so someone had mentioned earlier, I thought was really interesting, talking about getting more personal. With technology, we actually are thinking about, we're hypothesizing that maybe we get less personal, use technology to get less personal, and maybe evoke, again, this is in progress, and maybe evoke a more positive emotional response from the law enforcement who are working with the technology. And so I should have said that our approach is not to use technology, the pilot software that Kevin and his team are working on exclusively, but to approach this from a multi-instructional mode. So to combine using technology with in-person conversations on difficult conversations, on scenarios that they interact with through the technology. So we are currently working with the Columbus Police Department, that is our community partner. So I'll just give a little bit of background that we are very fortunate to have funding from the Ohio State University Seeds of Racial Justice Fund. And I'm happy to announce that Simone and I are also part of a team that has just received a grant award from AAA ICDR to work with the Columbus Police Department on another project where we will be doing, I heard someone say earlier, surveys. We will be doing surveys. We will be working on focus groups with officers within the department, and then working on training. And so it's a continuum for us in terms of our research and our scholarship in this area. So with that, I'm going to pass the microphone to my colleague and my friend, and my former student, by the way. Dr. Drake had me. Dr. Drake had me for negotiations when she was already a professor here. She was an assistant professor here, and she had the curiosity. I've heard that word a lot this morning. She had the curiosity to pursue a master's in law while she was already a professor here in our building, and she took my class, and that's actually how we got to know each other. So I'm going to pass the microphone to my friend and former student, Dr. Drake.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Yeah, Katrina and I have worked a number of times on things, particularly with community engagement. So it was kind of great to reconnect for this project. And I'm going to be talking at the last, the Harvard one, so I don't want to say too much. I just maybe we'll go back and I just want to say one thing about the multidisciplinary approach. Is a lot of times you see this work with kind of trying to work through community and law enforcement relations being it's in certain disciplinary areas. Okay? So a lot of times it's not so much legal, it's more like public policy or you might have criminologists. And my thought always about things that are policy related is if you have to keep revisiting it, then there's obviously something that's not working in the approach. And so I work in lots of different areas, but it's always kind of thinking from this humanistic perspective of trying to kind of recenter the human, particularly when it's interconnected with race and gender. And I think that really kind of helps you think differently. However, I mean, in this particular research project, it might seem like we're doing the opposite by working with technology. But I think it's really kind of a hypothesis around if you can somewhat neutralize this training that, and the research will show that whether people actually appreciate diversity, equity, and inclusion or resent it, a lot of times there's a common sense that shared that it's not effective, right? Or it's not something that they want to participate in because they don't really see it being useful. Or, and so that might have a lot to do with who's doing the training, but it also might just have to do with modes and techniques. And so, you know, this is very much a digital and technology age. I have 3 children and they are always like glued to the electronics. And increasingly, police forces people are aging out and you're hiring new. And so it's really a very scientific kind of hypothesis of, will this be one means that we might actually see more measurable outcomes and what kind of change it produces, okay? Or what kind of, or even how the attitudes might change by approaching it through this method. But at the end of the day, it is to try to make sure that people who are often marginalized are seen as human and not just simply as subjects that need to be controlled. So that would be.
And this has been a great team beyond. I sort of view it. There's sort of this human side to this, and the law side, and you have to have. If you're going to have a technology side to this, the problem then, of course, is how to put it together. And maybe one perspective is we're just simply trying to get best practices DEI training into a phone, so that when the cop's out taking a break, he or she can, right? You can look at it that way. That's reasonable. But basically, for me, when I saw their title of your conference, I pulled the word rethinking and asked, it's computer system design for racial justice. Okay, and so in this project, there's 2 pieces for me, and that is how to get these ideas into software and accessible. Right now, we have 2 students in engineering working on this. They have chosen the software now, so we have a way to create the apps, and we'll use MATLAB, which is a scientific computing platform for. These will handle the front end. That's what you see on your app, and then back end is the algorithms running to do the training. Okay. People giving input to that, first of all, you got to understand officers and how best they learn. So you work on user interface, user experience for the officer. You have to have, I think you're never going to have technology do it all. So there's no way, I don't think. It's going to have to be supervised by a human of some sort. A model for that is cognitive behavioral therapy for major depressive disorder, which is also used for bias reduction, for instance. So we need to get a heavy dose psychology into the algorithms, make this scenario based. We've already worked with the Columbus Police Department, Simone and Katrina, and have a scenario. The scenario is programmed in MATLAB now, runs. It needs to be put in the app. That software is not been integrated. We like to do something small and concrete that makes sense first. I think this is a very hard project. I mean, for anything I'm working on in engineering at sea, this is a hard project. Okay. I think it's going to take. I think you'll have a reasonable version of this in 5 years, not 1 year like we've been given funding for. This is going to take a scale up. It's got to go out and work with people. Got to get a lot of expertise and eyes on it. So otherwise, this isn't happening. It's just getting started. I think there needs to be a major project with everyone, our team, and more. We need psychologists on board for sure, and officers and leaders in police, law enforcement.
Well, thank you all very much. You've given us a lot to think about. Dr. Brackney, you get to share your thoughts first.
So thank you. The multidisciplinary approach always excites me, to the extent that I've said to Katrina, I'm forcing myself onto this team, whether they like it or not. Like, I have literally said, oh, I'm already starting to write your paper for you. That's how excited I am about it. But even with that excitement, I think we need to approach this carefully, right? That are we attempting to treat a symptom and not the disease or the cure? the first thoughts I had as I read through the paper and the reiterations that kept coming through, and I saw Katrina's comments, was all training for any individual skills-based training must be realistic, relevant, meaningful, and with frequency, enough that it becomes part of their habits that will overcome possibly their internal biases as well as their external biases. The other thing I was thinking about more importantly was, again, some of the assumptions. If the assumption is that the training, the curriculum and content is sufficient, and that it's the methodology or the mode of delivery, the pedagogy, or the way in which we've gone about implementing this knowledge, we better be sure of that assumption, that the training is the right training to give the desired outcome, which is less interactions indicate less use of force, right? The less frequency we have, the less likely there is to have a negative outcome or impact in Black community. Also, when we're talking about surveys, I think this might be the pre-test, post-test. You really are going to need to see where your officers are now and what is their understanding of the way in which we're expecting them to behave, right? CBT talks a lot about how do you change, CBT, cognitive behavioral theory, talks a lot about how do you change the way you think about things so that it manifests itself in a physical behavior, the way that you actually behave. And one of the other things that I was really hesitant about is, what does a community partner look like? Particularly, and I hope Columbus PD is not here, but maybe they should be, is, do we have authentic community partners or do we have hostages? And what I mean by that is, who's going to say no as a policing agency to things that we can do so that you have a better relationship in minority and Black communities, particularly after the public execution of George Floyd, right? No one's going to say, sorry, not interested. And Columbus particularly has a history of violence in Black communities. They are being invited in by, or the Justice Department has been invited in, they're possibly facing consent decrees for their patterns and practices of abusive behaviors. So being careful about who your partners may be and understanding their full intentions for how they're engaged. So is it possible that they may sabotage, either intentionally or unintentionally, your approach so that they can say, well, we did it, it doesn't work. And the final thing I would ask is, for any DEI training, I really wish we would get away from diversity, equity, and inclusion. Inclusion often means forced assimilation. That if I'm going to be included in your construct of a university or a police department or et cetera, I then have to, in order to be welcomed in, assimilate in to be part of that process. So if we're looking for an equity and justice system, that's, I think, the technology should be really powerful. And the last consideration is, technology is never neutral, no matter what. Everyone who designs it, the lens in which I see it, the way in which I receive it. And if you want to really think about that, there's a video, All Lights Everywhere, that talks about body-worn cameras in Baltimore and how they're saying that cameras are neutral, and that's how we sell it to communities. They are far from neutral, and that they only present a single perspective, an outward-facing one, and never one in which we turn the lens inward to see how we are behaving as an organization or as an individual. So if you don't mind, this sister's jacking your project, and I would so be honored to at least allow me to continue to read what you're doing and how you're going about your work.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brackney. And now what we will do is I'm going to engage our panelists in a conversation for about the next 15 or 20 minutes. I would invite the audience to share questions that they might have with us. If my iPad works correctly, theoretically, I will be able to see the questions with Professor Froehlich's help. And so we'll get some of your questions addressed as well, if you're tuning in via Zoom. But thank you, and we've got you know, wonderful researchers on this stage who are currently engaged in work with 2 police departments. One, I think, the 3rd largest police department in the country in Los Angeles, and another very large metropolitan police department in Columbus, Ohio. And we've heard conversations in the earlier panel about neutrality and about power balancing. And I guess I thought we'd start there because in order to do this work between community and police departments, each of you needs a partner in this work to be able to sort of get inside the police departments. So Professor Blondell, if I could return to you, in the work that you've done and as you thought about it in this paper, how do you think about neutrality in your role in doing this research?
Well, not. Complete crisis of profession, identity. I've had a complete change in terms of how I thought about this project and also doing work in this space. So I did know from the public sector working with law enforcement how difficult it was and how much my credibility would need to, how much I would need to understand policing. So I spent a year trying to educate myself on and go on CompStat, on the union, on behavioral science, in order to have a space where I could train from. I partnered with, in most of my training, with a retired chief. And so the 2 of us worked together. This is internal police department training. I am no longer neutral, right? I am now seen as a friend of the department. On the other hand, I run a community mediation project where we've mediated thousands and thousands of cases for, you know, citizens of Los Angeles County. And so I had the remnant of a belief that I could convene a neutral process. I'm not, part of the, you know, learnings of the initial pilot stage is that I will not position it as a neutral process in the future. The money is coming through LAPOA. So this was very important. Open Society was interested in lifting up labor. So they wanted to give money to a labor organization. Many pundits have said, you know, that if part of the solution will likely be with labor because they have such a strong hold on departments. They wanted to empower voices in labor to do something different, to change their own organizations. I assume. At a certain point, the money was held up and LAPOA didn't want it. And both Pepperdine and the department said, we'll take it. And the grantor said no. However, the money is going through labor or quasi-labor organization, but they are also members of the police department, ranging from sergeant to chief. So they have a challenge of neutrality as well, right? So of what I've learned, and I could go on and on and on about this, because I think there's another aspect I haven't talked about, but I'll just throw a note to, which is what happens in the room and the power balancing within the room and traditional notions of what dispute resolvers project they can do, which I question, is also a moment in, that I think we could talk about. But the structure itself going forward will not be framed from the position of neutral. I could say a lot more. It's the place I have to do the work. And talking to Dr. Chief last night, I was, I'm emotional talking about it. The voice of fearlessness that I heard her work in terms of doing change is something that I will aspire to, but I don't feel yet. So.
Thank you, Dr. Drake or Professor Lee, would you care to speak on how you see your role in the design of a process, being both inside the department in some respects and also designing for the community?
Okay, well, I do a lot of community engaged work, and so whether it's working with police departments or just in other facets of the community, I mean, I'm very aware that I always ultimately represent OSU. I'm a professor, and even if I want to go into a community like I grew up in, which is South Linden, which is near campus, I'm not really part of that community anymore. I don't really think of that as neutrality or anything. I just think of it as a reality of how you have to engage with practices of engagement, and there's a lot of self kind of reflection that has to go into that in a sense of kind of where you are positioned. And so with the police department, I mean, here I do critical race and gender studies, and I want to work with the police. I live with a police officer. And so I feel I very much kind of straddle this sort of middle space where I'm seeing issues, and I have to work really hard, I think, to try to see issues from both sides. And perhaps neutrality, and I'm a language person, so I'm not so sure if I want to abandon neutrality entirely, because there is a very conscious and deliberate effort that I have to make to be able to see both sides, or to work to try to see perspectives from both sides, whether I agree with it or not. Because I think there's a great risk if I ever come across as partial in one way or the other, that it can risk the ability to have that collaboration. And then as far as the software, that part too, I hear a lot of complaints about, someone standing in front of people and telling them what they shouldn't do, or telling them that they're wrong, or, I mean, even worse, I've heard even in schools where training has happened, like K through 12, and the DEI trainer tells people, well, you're racist. And just from a rhetorical perspective, you're not going to get very far that way. And maybe, I mean, this is crossing into a whole other area, but I think this kind of work has sort of become everybody and anybody's pickup game lately, to the point where I think that's how you end up with people who are standing in front of groups and making accusations as opposed to educating. And even training, I think, is not the right word. Educating is something different than training. And so until I think you can kind of neutralize some of those dynamics that I don't think should be happening in the first place, maybe technology can help with that. Do you feel the same when you're using gaming theory and the computer system is telling you, wrong, you lose, you made the wrong choice, go back to start and try that again? Does it have the same kind of reaction, same kind of effect as if someone stands in front of you and says, absolutely not, you should not say that, or you should not? And so I don't know. I mean, that's why I think all of this is very much a science project in a way, and in a way in which I don't think we usually see this kind of work entering into science.
And that raises a really interesting point, and maybe Dr. Passino wants to weigh in for a moment, because he really has made, as I understand it, sort of humanistic technology design. Am I using the terms correctly even?
Oh, yeah.
Could you hold the mic a little closer?
Oh, yeah, you're there.
Well, particularly if you're saying, yes, hold the mic a little closer to your mouth.
Okay, so, sorry.
That's it.
So we call it human-centered design. Human-centered design is a thing over the college. With respect to this issue of the divides between the various groups, this is complicated. From an engineering perspective, everybody should be on board. You couldn't do a training out properly without having input from the community or the police officers. I don't think you could do it. And if you think about it, from the moment you have your smartphone in your pocket, how did Apple develop that? They asked a whole lot of people and rated it and designed and redesigned. They do all that all the time to make sure everybody likes it. So, this takes a major effort. The other thing I've been curious about here this morning, it seems to me there's the officer out on the street we were talking to said, look, he felt it all comes down to, are we doing community policing, serve and protect, or are we suppressing crime? What's the philosophy? He said. I mean, it makes me wonder if there shouldn't be a reevaluation of what else needs to be done to integrate community with software and apps. This can all be done distributed. Can you get survey information from community on perception by crowdsourcing or from the officers? I mean, I just wonder if that an information gathering or coordination system might make sense. Now, that's not something I'll do. You let a company do that. I mean, really, that's a hard programming problem, but that's very doable, right? We have it all in our pockets right now with social media. I'm talking about modification. These things are very doable.
You know, and you raise an interesting question. One of the questions in the chat was to talk about the myth of power balance in this work, and wondered if you could expand on that, Professor Blondell, or I know Dr. Brackney probably has some views about that, but if Professor Blondell, if you want to
I'll say
speak a little more to that.
I will say a word or two about it. The myth of power balancing. I agree, Simone made such a good point that there's an intellectual honesty perspective that we have, understanding our power and position as practitioners, our positionality. My positionality as a white woman, my positionality having knowledge, my positionality, that's one thing. And then also creating systems in terms of your curriculum design, creating to the extent that you can in the room a balanced experience. What I realized in this process is that the ways that I had been taught and that I had used in other spaces to balance power were not working. And that was a humbling, troubling, Dr. Chief said she could hear in my paper the anxiety of, there's a sense of, an identity that's falling away from me in terms of what has worked in other spaces, or the discrete conflict of a commercial mediation, or the laboratory of small claims court, where I've worked in, where you have very diverse parties, but you don't have this sense of one of the most difficult questions of our time, of systems of power and oppression, of brutal killings, of, this space is so deeply polarized and divided that the need for new definitions around power balancing are so important. I have some ideas about that, but I'll pause in terms of what.
Professor Lee, maybe I can ask you, in order to do this work in the first place, it's critically necessary to build trust. Obviously, the police agency is one entity with which trust must be built. The community is another. We talked about unions having perhaps a perspective that may be slightly different than the structure itself. Could you speak a little bit to the issue of building trust and how you think about building trust with those different parties as you're designing these systems?
Yes. So we have given a lot of thought to this even before we approached the police, right? And as Stephanie mentioned earlier, this is a closed system that we're approaching, and so we did give quite a bit of thought to it. And on our team, we do have someone who lives with a police officer, and some of the people who we are interacting with in the Columbus Police Department know of Dr. Drake or know her, and so that was, I'm being perfectly transparent, part of how we've done it so far. But we know that what's ahead of us is more relationship building, more trust building. I have personally, along with all of us, have been down to the police academy. We've been in their spaces where they do the training. We have talked to the commander who heads up the academy and the training for the Columbus Police Department. and spoken with them. And part of what we're trying to do is to gather information about how they already do their training, and then building the trust that way, making sure that we are asking the questions, that we are being curious about what they do, and not, right? We need to be really careful and not prejudging or letting any of our prejudging come through to the extent we are, And I think we have to be very open and flexible in how we're working with this project. And like Kevin has said, this is going to be a years-long endeavor. This is not something that we're going to be able to build overnight. Maybe Apple could do it, but it's going to take us a while because we want to do something that's worthwhile. And also we are working on process, where we're thinking about process the whole time. And so far, we've only discussed Columbus Police Department, but our hope is that what we grow here over the course of a period of time, it's going to be a lot of time, that it's something that can be used by another police department. And so maybe not an LAPD, right? An LAPD is different from a CPD, but perhaps a band of police departments across the country that have more in common with the Columbus Police Department. So that is something also that we have our eye on. Okay, so I will stop there. I think each of us could go on and on.
Well, I think you raised a number of important points. I guess not least among which is that it took us a long time to get to where we are today in the United States. And so this isn't a quick fix. To Dr. Passino's point, it's not going to be a year and the app solves the issue. In the first session at Stanford, the scholars who were talking about it, and they were talking about reparations in particular, were talking about an issue that took hundreds of years to develop and is likely going to take decades and perhaps centuries to work out of. So, but we were talking about trust, and I guess let me Dr. Passino, while I've got you here, ask, some of the technology that's been introduced to police officers of late has exposed some of the behaviors and some of the actions that police officers have engaged in. Do the police trust that the technology that you're going to be delivering is going to help them? Because, one of the last things we saw on video maybe didn't help.
This gets really sensitive. I think some people, let me take it away from the police department. If I take my app and hand it to someone, my neighbor, and say, you really need to use this. He's like, you're calling me a racist. I'm not doing squat with this thing. So I think that's a usual human reaction to this sort of thing. I think what I'm kind of concerned about it. I mean, read about DEI training, all of this, there's a lot of human approaches. There's not a lot of computer approaches. And yet there's a lot in psychology from social psychology, et cetera, about biased decision making, how it changes when you're under pressure, how under stress, under time pressure, what happens. So I do think we can use that. Does that answer?
I think, again, you're sort of inside the technological piece of this and how it relates to humans. I think in the chat, I'm told people think tech is a great idea to try to get at this issue clearly as an adjunct, as well as in-person training that will, of course, continue to affect behavioral change. So you've got a lot of fans in the chat.
Oh, look, I mean, remember with technology, it's all about iteration, this iterative improvement. I mean, first iPhone came out, right, was very different than what's in my pocket now. And that's because a lot of people are on board trying to make that. So I think there needs to have a lot of eyes on and a lot of money. I think you could do a reasonable training app for $5 million over 5 years and get you started. I say that only because you got to have a corporate partner who's going to scale it all up. Get Apple, get whoever, and let us do the research here at the university and let them take it away. And you have police, everybody is involved at the university level. It's like we're the R&D for the home.
Let me just put that one.
Well, I would ask a question of the chief. The resistance to the academy is one issue, but the resistance to technology is also something that will be evolving with the new generations that are coming in. But I am curious about what is that resistance to technology within law enforcement? What's it about?
Yeah. So the resistance to technology, at least in my perspective, right? So I spent 38 years in policing before I just transferred into academia. And the resistance is the culture of policing that is reinforced by the processes and the procedures, right? So we always talk about the culture of an organization. If we can just change the culture of the organization. The culture of policing is functioning exactly the way that the institution has been designed and developed, period. So the resistance is this. If I have documented that I understand and know and learn, and all of you lawyers in here, the thing you want is evidence and documentation that something existed. The resistance is if I put it on paper, I'm now held accountable. And I'm in a system where the power dynamics will never be equitable, no matter what, right? Apple can develop this system and they can do it in 5 years, but do Black and brown bodies have another 5 years to wait for technology to bring us to where we need to be? The other resistance, at least as I see it, right? And just riffing off the neutrality and how do you stay neutral, right? Dr. Kozar talked about being careful about using neutrality and status quo interchangeably, because we often don't want to be perceived as the person who's going to disrupt the apple cart. Technology disrupts the apple cart in a lot of ways that makes policing uncomfortable. But what I always say about what we're all attempting to do, because we're so desperate right now to rethink our system designs because of the public executions we've seen over and over and over again of individuals at the hands of policing, is a thing I always worry about when we put rethink or reimagine, is that we keep playing with the same deck chairs. What about thinking about system designs as the first innovator, not rethinking? What about imagining policing differently versus reimagining policing? And what that does is it gets out and digs deep into the soil of which all of these things are going to continue to sprout out of. No matter what you do with technology, unless you deal with the system of policing, not the individual of policing, you're just doing these one-offs. And it doesn't mean we don't do the hard work, right? We come at it with every tool we have. But for me, the resistance comes from now I am accountable. You have turned that spotlight on me. There is metadata that proves I engaged this many times, I knew or should have known, so I can be held liable with either in my department or in a courtroom. Not likely, but in a courtroom as well.
Yeah. Could I? I mean, this issue is, could you do a little experiment? If you took, I was wondering this recently with the visit of the police here in Columbus. What if we just took, as a simple start at getting data, just ask every officer, turn on the smartphone, track GPS tracking and send that up to the cloud. Let's put it together, see where everyone was every day, all day. No way would that happen, right? So that's an example of dumping, right? And yet, that could be useful, right? I mean, that's useful information.
Right, which is interesting. It's a profession that loves surveillance, but doesn't love to be surveilled, right? It loves surveillance. It's going to track your phone wherever it wants, your GPS on your car, But then if you say, well, turn yours on so I can see how you engage all day. Whoa, you're spying on me. This is officer safety. Somebody might ambush me and kill me. I mean, like, it's all sorts of reinforcing blue socialization within that impenetrable wall that is, you know, every police department, right? So I think about that all the time. They really do. I mean, if there's a technology, license plate readers, we have technology that can, as the cars go past, can look inside your car. That's x-rays, it's infrared, shows how many people are in the car, the type of packages that are in the car. We have drones, we call them unmanned aerial devices, so it seems less, you know, offensive or violent. And then we track all of those things. We track your cell phones, we track your credit cards. Here at this university, don't tap in or swipe anything. I know where you eat, what you eat, point of sales, if you've been to the cafeteria. But if you ask an officer, well, where were you last night? Whoa, 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 whoa. It becomes, how did you spend your time and your energy and government dollars? Becomes very defensive about why you're asking me those kinds of things. So until you understand the culture of policing in a very real way, the technology and all of the negotiations that you're going to do are going to be extremely difficult. But again, it doesn't mean we don't do it.
Well, I just to follow up on that,
where this work has lit the fire in me is, well, I'll just start by saying, I don't know how many of you have read this article by Pat Vivian, which I love so much. It's about the way that organizations, purpose-driven organizations, do conflict. So they actually act out what their purpose is, they do the opposite of it. So if you are to protect and serve, if you're an upside down organization, which means you have bad leadership or you aren't supported or you aren't funded, then the way you do your conflict is to do the exact opposite of that. The fire lit in me, because I've been a practitioner that helps organizations become better, is in helping mainly through LAPOA, looking at the impact of the organization on women and women of color in policing. And also just policing, well, this is where I found this might be my little place, I don't know. But the need to heal the organization is so acute that is one place of change. It is not the most important place of change. It's not looking at the people getting hurt, but it is one avenue where I do think the healing of the organization, having a place that you can show up and work where you have dignity, I'm gonna get emotional, but just dignity, and you are treated with respect. They hold, in terms of the community, there is such abuse of power that's happening there, and it's reflecting a mirror. It's reflecting a mirror, and we need to think about that as well.
Professor Lee, I saw you shaking your head.
Yeah, so, oh, I wasn't shaking my head at anything you were saying. I was just nodding and thinking about the project that I mentioned earlier that we're working on, in addition to the technology project with Dr. Passino, and working internally with the police department, and hopefully helping to facilitate some really difficult conversations. So, for example, conversations after an event has happened, after a use of force event has happened, and helping them facilitate those types of internal conversations. And that is what we are working towards with the project that I mentioned earlier, for which we just received the funding. But the notification that we will be funded. And so we're going to be starting with surveys first. So that's our first step. We're not going to be talking to officers until after we've done the surveying. And then we're going to convene focus groups and talk in small groups with groups of officers from marginalized groups. So that is one very intentional step that we will be taking with that project. And again, just to echo what Stephanie was talking about, we want to help the officers have these conversations. These are hard. It was even hard for our group. And I feel like we have a lot of facilitators here. We have a lot of people here who do this for a living. And even then, right, even on the chats on Zoom, it was hard to have these difficult conversations, even among us who we do this for a living, a lot of us, and we guide others. And so so that's part of our work. That's why I was moving my head. Like, that is part of our work. That's part of what we're working towards. And we know that it's going to be challenging. We've even talked as a team, where do we even, and I'm open to hearing from anyone here, where do we even do these focus groups? Physically, where do we place them? I would love to hear from the chief on that. And so we encounter all of these questions, and we're just only beginning to scratch the surface. And I see that project is very compatible and part of the same continuum as the technology project that we are working on with Dr. Passino.
You know, there's a question in the chat that speaks to the fact that police departments maintain the geographic divides in our communities, mostly between communities of affluence and opportunity and pockets or spaces of poverty and disinvestment. And they were wondering how the DEI training might help dismantle the approach to policing, and secondarily, I guess, a view of a question about whether we should instead focus on investments in neighborhoods that have been so depleted. I don't know that that was the focus of your research. I assume the work that relates to conflict resolution and design of the department's work might ultimately translate into that. But so would any of you be willing to jump into that question?
I could say one thing, but yeah.
Sure. Mostly it was, as I said, the police departments maintain current divides in our communities. The question is, how does DEI training help to dismantle that method of policing?
I can say just one thing
That it's not directly responsible. Were you going to speak, Professor Drake?
Oh, you can go first. I was gonna.
you were, then please do, please do. I thought that was fine.
I wanted to make sure I understood the question, but I don't know. I think that's giving a little too much power and control to police. For control, the police are controlling what they're told to control, what they're told to do, what's already been put in place by systems, by policy. That I think you need to look more at, like the city planning and urban development and things like that. It's, I mean, in that regard, I think it's more of they are doing what's already in place. And so that I think goes to kind of looking more at the symptom than the actual root. And the root is so much deeper than policing. I think the question that you were reading, that was really more of a defund direction that it was going. But yes, I mean, they're just part of the system, but they are not themselves given that extent of a power that they can just completely control. Those things are already in place, right? I mean, if you think about someplace here like Upper Arlington, Grandview, these suburbs that are actually literally within the city, and the redlining that had existed to keep non-white people out. The police didn't have anything to do with that, but they did get to then enforce if people are crossing those lines and in those spaces. So I think it's a much more complex and really multidisciplinary than thinking about how this all comes together to have created a kind of policing system that we have today. It didn't just manifest on its own.
Yeah, of course. Well, we have just a few minutes left, excuse me, and so I wanted to give you each a chance to leave us with some closing thoughts. We've had, a conversation about your papers, about issues of neutrality, about trying to create trust between police and communities and between yourselves as the neutral in quotes facilitator assisting in this work. So I wonder if you could, each from your own perspective, offer a closing thought. I'll let Chief Brackney go first, since she got to respond. That will put you in a position that you get to respond to Chief Brackney if you like. And I ask you to take about 30 seconds.
30 seconds. As I think about my 38-year in policing, starting at the age of 2 years old, and then moving to where I am now, and then the new work that I'm doing on policing and what that looks like. My closing thoughts is I have evolved in a way that I never thought that I would evolve. I am now a firm believer, as much as I was in the system and thought that I can deconstruct from inside out. I am now a believer when it comes to policing and the criminal legal system. It is a system that cannot be reimagined. It cannot be reformed. And as the law students that are here, it is not a system that will, it will continue to function as it functions unless we do something different. So for me, I have evolved and can no longer be neutral in the way that I approach this work. It is a system that must be torn down, and anyone who stays in it, they are reformed, not the system. They are rehabilitated through their training, the way that you do conflict, the way that technology can influence them. But more importantly, everybody has to do the work in this room. Nobody gets off the hook anymore in 2022. We either all do the work or we start getting out of the way of people who are trying to do the work in a real and meaningful way. And that has been a 40-year growth process for me, from one of naivete to think that I could deconstruct it to one that says, okay, if I can't do it from the inside, I'm going to do it from the outside.
My first comment is that is so powerful, what I just heard. And I can't wait to talk to you more about it. So I am going to dive down deep into a detail because I'm just left reeling from that amazing comment. I wanted to talk a little bit about convening, and just because it's one thing that wasn't said, I will say that the notion of bringing together groups that represent the community has completely been toppled for me. And that one of the ways that I'm theorizing, I have no idea, that convening might work better in some of the conversations that will happen and perhaps reinforce the inequity. So that's the bigger question. But the conversations is to bring people together en masse so that the community shares a strong, powerful identity as well as the officers. So bringing together a diverse community kind of diluted the power of having shared experience to talk with officers. And that's one thing that I'm taking away from this work.
I have just two very quick thoughts, and one is just gratitude to everyone on this stage, everyone here in this audience, and who's on Zoom for doing this work. And I go back to the comment that this is brave work. This is really hard work. So my gratitude. Second, I just want to encourage all of you to share with your communities, with your circles and your orbits, the work that the dispute resolution field is doing in this area. I'm not sure that others may know outside of our circle here in this room and on Zoom. Share with others who may not know of your involvement in the dispute resolution field, who know you in another capacity, and let them know that, hey, we are doing this work. How can we partner? What can I learn from you? And so that's my second thought to share.
I don't know that I really have much to add, but one thing that I would say is education. I hear a lot about training, and that's very different than educating. And even with other social problems being beyond police violence, like for me, it always goes back to K through 12 and particularly public education and who has access and what, because it just determines life outcomes, right? Whether you're talking about food deserts, whether you're talking about gun violence, whether you're talking about police killings. For me, it's always there, and it's been sometimes I don't think people believe me when I start saying things like that, is I think they want such immediate and direct solutions. And I think that that's just often not possible.
Thank you. Yeah. In hearing all conversations, I'm trying to find a common theme, and I'm basically confused. So let me take a stab anyway. So technology for me is anything that extends human capability. So this is extending my capability to project my voice. You can think about your phone, you can call your mother now, okay, from where she is. So in terms of that capability, what capability is, that is power, right? It gives you power. And I think that has to be considered, because who has ownership of that technology and where it reaches to, that's giving somebody power. And so I'm concerned, this creates concern for me, because if you're injecting technologies into this police system, it's not clear whether it's going to be used for good or bad. And I think that I could know that. There's no way someone like me can know that. It's got to take all the subject matter experts in the real system, not the little computer system.
Well, thank you all. And it's great to have such a multidisciplinary team, because it's going to take the thinking of all of us and all of the disciplines that you've mentioned that aren't on this stage to rethink system design for policing, and particularly as it relates to the relationship between policing and race. I congratulate the authors of these two important papers and the research that you're doing. I know it's ongoing. We look forward to seeing your articles when they come out this summer and hearing from you in the future. Please help me thank
Give you a deadline.
Professor